On a hot August morning in 1969, a housekeeper entered a peaceful home in Los Angeles and discovered something so unsettling that for a moment she believed it was all a terrible joke. But this was no joke, and it was only the beginning of a story that would shock the world. How did a charismatic musician gather a group of young followers and lead them to commit some of the most infamous crimes of the 20th century? Welcome to Learn English with My Story. Today, we'll explore a fascinating and true crime case that changed America. Along the way, we'll learn some useful and natural English together, so you can improve your skills while listening to a compelling story. The story begins not with the crimes, but with the man at the center of them all, Charles Manson. Born in 1934, Manson had a difficult and unstable childhood. He spent much of his early life in institutions and prisons for various crimes. By the time he was released from prison in 1967, he was 32 years old. He arrived in San Francisco during the famous Summer of Love. This was a time of great social change. Many young people felt lost and were searching for meaning, community, and a different way of life. Manson, with his intense eyes and confident way of speaking, was very charismatic. By the way, charismatic means having a special quality that makes other people like and follow you. For example, the new manager was very charismatic and popular with the team. Manson played the guitar and spoke of a new philosophy of peace and love. He quickly began to attract a group of followers, mostly young women who were vulnerable. You know, vulnerable means easy to hurt or influence, emotionally or physically. For example, he was in a vulnerable state after losing his job. These young people were often from troubled backgrounds, and they felt disconnected from their families and from society. To them, Manson seemed like a wise teacher, a father figure they could finally trust. Soon, this group of followers became known as the Manson Family. But it wasn't a family in the traditional sense. It was a cult with Charles Manson as its absolute leader. He had a powerful ability to understand people's weaknesses and use them to gain control. Here, gain control is a common collocation. It means to get the power to direct or influence someone or something. For example, the new CEO quickly gained control of the company. The family eventually moved to Spahn Ranch, an old movie set on the outskirts of Los Angeles. There, they lived an isolated life, completely separated from the outside world. Manson's control over his followers became total. He would talk for hours, sharing his strange ideas and philosophies. His followers listened to his every word. They completely looked up to him. The phrasal verb, look up to, means to admire and respect someone. For example, many young children look up to professional athletes. Manson slowly began to introduce a new, darker idea. He called it Helter Skelter, a name he took from a Beatles song. He believed a terrible race war was coming, and he told his followers that they, the family, would survive it and then rule the world. He convinced them that they needed to help start this war. His followers, who were now completely cut off from their old lives, believed him without question. To be cut off from something is a phrasal verb. It means to be isolated or separated from it. For example, after the storm, the village was cut off from the rest of the country. Manson's followers had given up their identities to become part of the group. They did whatever he asked, believing it was for a greater purpose. They began committing small crimes for him, like stealing. But soon, his instructions would become far more serious. He needed them to be ready to do anything. But even with his powerful influence, how could he convince them to commit murder? In the summer of 1969, the atmosphere in Los Angeles was tense. Manson felt his dream of becoming a famous rock star was failing. A music producer named Terry Melcher had once shown interest in Manson's music, but then decided not to help him. Melcher used to live in a house at 1050 Cielo Drive. Even though Melcher had moved out, Manson's anger toward him and the world he represented was growing. On the night of August 8, 1969, Manson gathered a few of his most loyal followers. He gave them a terrifying command. He told them to go to the house on Cielo Drive and to be violent and destructive. One of his followers, Tex Watson, was put in charge. 3 young women, Susan Atkins, Patricia Krenwinkel, and Linda Kasabian, went with him. They didn't really think through the consequences of their actions. The phrasal verb, think through, means to carefully consider the possible results of an action. For example, you need to think through your decision before you quit your job. When they arrived at the house, it was occupied by the famous actress Sharon Tate, who was 8 months pregnant, and 4 of her friends. What happened next was a brutal and senseless crime that horrified the city. The followers, acting on Manson's orders, murdered everyone inside the home. They showed no mercy. The event was completely baffling to the police and the public. By the way, baffling is an adjective. It means something is impossible or very difficult to understand. For example, the reason for his sudden decision was baffling to everyone. The next day, the news spread across the city. People were in shock. They felt a false sense of security had been broken. A false sense of security is a common expression. It means a feeling that you are safe when you are not. For example, leaving the door unlocked gives people a false sense of security. But the horror was not over. The very next night, Manson went out with a few of his followers, including the group from the night before. He was unhappy with the chaos of the first crime and wanted to show them how it should be done. They chose a house at random, the home of a supermarket executive named Lino LaBianca and his wife, Rosemary. Manson went inside first to tie up the couple. Then, he left and ordered his followers to go inside and kill them. The group followed his orders without hesitation. They had come to believe that Manson was a kind of prophet, and they would do anything he asked. They didn't dare to go against his wishes. To go against someone means to oppose or disagree with them. For example, it's often difficult for employees to go against their boss. For weeks, the city of Los Angeles lived in fear. The 2 crimes were so different in their victims and locations that the police didn't connect them at first. They had very few clues. It seemed the killers might get away with it. The idiom, get away with it, means to do something wrong or illegal without being caught or punished. For example, he cheated on the test and thought he would get away with it. The investigators were struggling. They interviewed many people and followed every lead, but they couldn't seem to put the pieces together. Put the pieces together is an idiom. It means to understand a situation by looking at all the information. For example, the detective put the pieces together and solved the mystery. The breakthrough in the case came from an unexpected place. A few months later, Susan Atkins, one of the killers, was in jail for a different crime. While there, she started talking to another inmate. She couldn't help but brag about her involvement in the murders. The phrasal verb, brag about, means to talk too proudly about something you have done. For example, he was bragging about how much money he earned. The inmate was horrified and decided to inform the police. This was the crucial tip that the investigators needed. They now had a name, the Manson Family. Slowly, the police built their case. They found Linda Kasabian, the follower who had acted as the driver and lookout during the Tate murders. She had not participated directly in the violence and was filled with regret. She was in two minds about what to do. The expression, "in two minds," means you are unable to decide about something. For example, I'm in two minds about whether to accept the job offer or not. Ultimately, she agreed to testify against the others in exchange for immunity. Her testimony was essential. She described the nights of the crimes in detail, explaining how Manson had directed everything. She made it clear that the followers were acting entirely under his spell. To be under his spell is an idiom. It means to be so fascinated by someone that you do whatever they say. For example, the audience was completely under the speaker's spell. The trial of Charles Manson and his followers began in 1970, and it was a media circus. The defendants laughed, sang songs, and showed no remorse for their actions. It was a disturbing spectacle that showed just how deeply they had been brainwashed. The word brainwashed means forced to believe something by controlling your mind. For example, the cult members had been brainwashed into thinking their leader was a god. The followers believed Manson's strange prophecies and his promises of a new world. They had given up their ability to think for themselves. The prosecutor, Vincent Bugliosi, worked hard to show the jury that Manson was the true person responsible, even though he hadn't physically killed anyone himself. He argued that Manson had orchestrated the entire thing. The situation was the tip of the iceberg regarding the family's other potential crimes. The tip of the iceberg is an idiom that means a small, noticeable part of a much larger problem that is hidden. For example, these complaints are just the tip of the iceberg. Finally, after a long trial, the jury reached a verdict. Charles Manson and his followers who had carried out the murders were found guilty. They were all sentenced to death. However, California abolished the death penalty a short time later, so their sentences were changed to life in prison. They would serve a life sentence. To serve a life sentence is a common collocation in law. It means to spend the rest of one's life in prison. For example, he was found guilty and will serve a life sentence. The Manson family crimes left a deep scar on American culture. It marked the end of the optimistic summer of love era and introduced a new kind of fear to the public. The story showed how vulnerable people searching for belonging could end up being manipulated into doing terrible things. The phrasal verb "end up" is very common. It means to finally be in a particular place or situation, often unexpectedly. For example, we got lost and ended up on the other side of the city. The case became a powerful and tragic reminder of the dangers of blind faith and the dark side of human influence. The story of the Manson family shows us how a search for community and purpose can sometimes lead people down a very dark path. It's a reminder of how powerful influence can be, for both good and for bad. If you want to continue discovering more fascinating real stories and improving your English at the same time, make sure to subscribe to the channel. We explore real events and real crimes to help you master the language in a way you won't forget. Thanks for listening, and we'll see you in the next story.